Listen, I wish Meredith could be here tonight. He can't because, well, he's deceased. But how inconvenient and how rude of Meredith. Now, again, I've got my notes back there, and I'm going to go back to those because I don't want to miss a thing to tell you guys tonight about the wonderful Meredith Willson and the wonderful show, The Music Man, and why I consider it a miracle. Believe me, and I'm going to make my case for you this evening. And so some of you, several of you saw the film. I know Shirley Jones was here several years ago that they were telling me, which I think is fantastic, and I know Shirley quite well because through my connection with the Music Man Foundation, which is Meredith's foundation that they set up. By the way, all the money that the Music Man makes in film and stage goes to this Music Man Foundation. More on that later. So my association with the Music Man Foundation and the Music Man Square in Mason City, Iowa. Who's ever been to the Music Man Square? Fantastic. If you haven't, you need to go there, to the Music Man Square. It's the Museum and Foundation in Mason City that is to perpetuate Meredith's legacy and music education. My undergraduate's in music education. My graduate's in communications, broadcasting. I wrote my thesis on a music publisher. And so through those associations, and again, I'll get a little bit more into that later, I got to know Shirley quite well and spent time in her home back when Marty Ingalls was still with us, and funny stories, and such a lovely, lovely lady, as many of you know if you got to see her when she was here. But we worked on some projects together for the Music Man Square. And I'll never forget, I'll tell you a quick Shirley Jones story, and I've got another one I'll hopefully have time to share with you later. So there I am in her house for the first time in Encino, you know, kind of an LA suburb where she and Marty lived, and a beautiful home. And so we're sitting in the living room, we're talking about these things, and the phone rings, and she excused herself. I mean, Shirley Jones answering her own phone. Don't you love it? And but doesn't surprise me. She's so down to earth. And so she steps out of the room for just a minute. So here I am by myself in Shirley Jones' living room. And I'm looking around, you know, and taking several things, of course, with me. No, I'm just kidding. But anyway, I saw her Academy Award that she won for Elmer Gantry. So when she's finished with the phone call, she was only out of the room for maybe 2 minutes. So she comes back, and as she's coming into the room, I couldn't resist. There's this beautiful baby grand piano, and you know, the beginning of Good Night, My Someone is that simple right-hand Amaryllis melody, da, 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 da. So I started playing that as she walked in the room. And she stopped, and she looked at me, she said, "Isn't that a lovely song?" I mean, so Shirley, I mean, she sang that ultimately in front of millions of people, you know, and she didn't have any kind of, you know, self-whatever in that moment. She could have, but she didn't. She said, "Isn't that a lovely song?" And indeed, it is a lovely song. Okay, a lot of ground to cover, so I've got to get my water ready, so I want to stay fueled up here this evening. Hang on. Okay, why did I write this book? Well, I wrote this book because, frankly, the publisher said, "Mark, we need another book on music. You wrote one, we need to write another one." Now, several of you, this is quite a crowd. At dinner, I mean, I know you're an austere gathering, and I love that. So there are probably several other authors in the room. So you know how it is to write a book. Listen, if you're going to write a book, you better be passionate about that subject, and you better be ready to be committed to it through all the editorial process. And Roman and Littlefield published this out of D.C., and they're serious about books. So 2 weeks passed, and I went back to the editor, and I said, "Okay, I'm going to write a book. I'll be willing to write, happy to write another book. And it's going to be on the Music Man." And I said, "Okay." And I said, "It's Miracle of the Music Man." And so, because here's why I wrote the book, you guys. Bachelor's degree in music education, trumpet player, 7th grade, all the way up. So I get the band thing. I get the marching band thing. But always, I loved music publishing, and even as a 6th grader, I was fascinated with all of that. So I got the music thing going, and then I was really into conducting into college, but I also had a passion for broadcasting. And so, and fascinated with all of that. So I got my degree in music ed, as I say. Then I went and changed my major before I was going to get my major in conducting, but before I even started grad school, went straight from undergrad to grad. I changed my major to broadcasting and wrote my thesis on a music publisher. So I was trying to figure out, how can I fuse both broadcasting and music? And so those are two seemingly different kind of things. And so in my rising senior year in college, my community theater, hometown community theater in North Carolina, where I'm from, said, Mark, we want you to conduct the pit orchestra for the Music Man. So that summer in 1892, I conducted the pit orchestra for the Music Man. Well, I didn't know the show before I conducted it. I knew of it. But then I learned about this guy named Meredith Willson. True story. There's a very, okay, I'll tell you what it is. Jeanine Tesori. How many of you know that name? She wrote Shrek and a bunch of things on Broadway. Jeanine told me, I'm a shameless name dropper. First book I wrote is called Confessions of a Shameless Name Dropper. Meredith said he was going to write a book called Everybody's a Name Dropper, including me. I found that out after I'd written my book, so another connection with Meredith. But anyway, there I was doing all of these things, conducting. Jeanine Tesori said, I was talking about Meredith Willson. I talk about Meredith whenever I get a chance to fit him into the conversation, and it makes sense. And she said, you know, Mark, I know someone who's a big Broadway person, and said, Meredith Willson, I don't know her work very well other than the Music Man. Now, if you ever go to the Great American Songbook Foundation in Carmel, Indiana, where I spent a lot of time, because Meredith Willson's papers are housed there, I spent a lot of time there combing through all the papers to write the book. He has funny papers where letters where people would call him a female, Mrs. Willson, dear Mrs. Meredith Willson, But he would, of course, have a very clever kind of rejoinder, retort to that. Hilarious. But in any event, I got to know this Meredith Willson person. Now, he was actually still alive, but I was 20, and I couldn't figure out how to make the connections on how to get to this Meredith Willson, because here was a man, I thought, who has combined music and broadcasting and did it in such a phenomenal way. And so I thought, I got to meet this man, or I'd like to know more and more about him. So I read everything I could get my hands on about Meredith Willson. It's back in the 80s, to be honest. And then, long story short, my first job out of grad school was running a radio station, a non-commercial radio station at a Methodist college in Kentucky, and teaching communications. And I did a radio program on Meredith Willson. But by then, I was a member of ASCAP, the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers. And so through ASCAP, I said, Meredith had just passed away. And so but I knew his widow, Rosemary, that she was in the obituary. So I said to my connection at ASCAP in New York, can you get me the phone number or a connection with Rosemary and see if she would be open to me interviewing her for this radio show that I'm going to do, this half-hour special on Meredith Willson and all of his songs. She said, well, I'll talk to her and I'll see what I can do. So Ellen, my friend at ASCAP in New York, contacted Rosemary Willson out in Brentwood, California, a suburb of LA, and she said, yes, I'll be happy to talk to this Mark Cabaniss. And so I got her on the phone as planned and recorded that interview and used clips of it on the program. And so at the end of that phone call, after we were off the air, I said, Mrs. Willson, would you be open for me dropping by sometime to see you in your home in California? So much nerve, all my life. Who would do that other than me, I guess, or maybe you. Anyway, she said, yes, Mark, I would be happy to do that. So, of course, I was thrilled. And I don't go out to, well, I do now, but back in those days, I wasn't going to LA, hardly ever. But I found a reason to go out to LA to go see Rosemary Willson. And so now it's time to go to see Rosemary in her home. And she said, now, Mark, this is before GPS, she said, now Meredith would always say, if you don't turn your wheels right at this point on the bridge, you're gonna miss the entrance to the house. So make sure you do that. And so I thought, oh, I'm in essence getting Meredith's directions to their house. So I went into their house where he wrote The Music Man, in that very home. And the piano on which he wrote The Music Man, there it was. And I said, is that? She said, yep, he wrote The Music Man on this. Now, Rosemary Renee, some of you will know that name. Renee Willson was his wife when he wrote The Music Man, but she passed away from cancer in 1966. and then he married Rosemary in 1968 on Valentine's Day. But Rosemary knew all the stories, and she knew 𝙈𝙨 very well, too. That's a whole other story in the book, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, she's leading me all over the house, and that was the first of many visits to that Brentwood home to be with Rosemary and to talk about Meredith, and she let me play on the piano upon which he wrote The Music Man. And it was almost, and there were pictures, one of which I have in the slides I'm going to show you here, of him getting the Big Brother and Big Sister Award from John F. Kennedy. There are lots of pictures on the wall of him with Ronald Reagan, you know, the great Ronald Reagan. And just there, someone had built him a miniature river city that they had on the coffee table over there, you know. And it was just filled with all of these beautiful bits. I didn't even plan to tell you this, but I'm gonna have to watch the clock. I'm telling you guys. Okay, so she told me this story. I love this story. Also on the wall was this Life magazine fold out of this parade. And so I said, now what's that? And she said, well, once upon a time, not long after The Music Man had opened on Broadway, Meredith's friend, Walt Disney, invited Meredith and 𝙈𝙨 to dinner at Disneyland. And you know, Walt had an office overlooking Main Street, USA. And so, and by the way, Rupert Holmes, the great Rupert Holmes, wrote the foreword to this book. You know, he wrote The Mystery of Edwin Drood and pop songs, and I know Rupert, blah, blah, blah. I told you I was going to drop names. But Rupert, the only reason I dropped the name there is that he compares in the foreword to this book, Meredith, to Walt Disney. And he makes some very clever, interesting connections, you see, that I had not even thought about in terms of Walt and Meredith. But again, you'll see what he said there. It's fascinating. Anyway, here's Meredith and 𝙈𝙨 and Walt Disney having dinner overlooking Main Street. And after dinner, Walt said, Meredith, I have a little something for you. This is a true story, according to Rosemary and Life magazine to prove it. He brings out a band director's coat, drum major's coat. He says, would you put this on, please? He puts this on. It's tailor-made, because obviously he talked to 𝙈𝙨 in advance to get his measurements. He said, now, Meredith, I want you to come out here onto the balcony overlooking Main Street. He leads Meredith and 𝙈𝙨 out to the balcony, and what would be there lined up but a whole 76 trombones parade standing there waiting at that appointed moment. Who else could pull this off but Walt Disney, okay? He gives Meredith a whistle. He says, Meredith, blow the whistle, and conduct them through 76 trombones. They marched down Main Street, and this huge parade became a photo in Life magazine, fold out of this gigantic 76 trombones parade that Walt Disney staged for Meredith. Isn't that incredible? That's just unbelievable. You know, and don't get me started about, you know, how we loved Walt Disney, you know, all of that. Okay, so that's why I wrote this book. I was drawn to Meredith's career many, many years ago. There are other books out there on Meredith Willson. We know that. Meredith himself wrote, But He Doesn't Know the Territory. I've read it 6 times, you know, and there are chunks of that book in my book, of course. But I thought before I wrote this book, I thought, now what can I add to what's already been said by Meredith himself about The Music Man, you know? Who do you think you are? As Meredith would say, he and 𝙈𝙨 would go and do programs and you know, the neck-bowed Hawkeyes. I was stubborn. He said, who do they think they are, you know, up there on that stage? But anyway, who do I think I am going to write a book on The Music Man? There's so much already out there. I mean, not a ton, but enough. I thought, well, what I can add is that perspective. You know, Meredith wrote But He Doesn't Know the Territory 2 years after The Music Man opened on Broadway. And a lot has happened in 65 years that show's been out, you know. So, and what happened while I was writing the book is, wouldn't you know it, as good fortune would have it, and people might think, I planned it, I didn't. They announced this big Broadway revival with Hugh Jackman and Sutton Foster in the leads. So I was halfway through writing the book, and so there are pictures of that show, that production, in the book. So I was able to comment on that even, as it turned out. And the main thing, everyone, was Rosemary. Rosemary, Rosemary. The story she told me. That all these, maybe she told other people too, but they're not in print, you know. And I also, several years ago, had the great honor of meeting with Cy Feuer. Now that name may mean something to some of you or nothing to all of you. Feuer was 50% of the legendary Broadway producing team of Feuer and Martin.